In honour of the purity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.
Saint Joseph,
Pray for us.
Saint Philomena,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you everyone for coming. If anyone has difficulty with I have a very strong accent, so somebody needs to be able to translate. I don't know if is anyone else here from the northeast of England? Perhaps Luke, where's Luke? Luke can translate more. So, as was mentioned, we are Franciscan Friars. We live in Gosport. We pray for us because we are opening a new house of formation on Monday in Portsmouth, where we already have 4 novices. So it was we were very happy to do the talk today because we have our spirituality comes through also through St. Maximilian Kolbe. We try to win the hearts of the souls in the world through the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, if anyone was here last year, we got a call from Joseph last year to do a talk on Father Patrick Peyton, who was called the Apostle of the Rosary last year. So I went to see my superior and said, I've been asked to do a talk on Father Peyton and I know nothing about him, expecting him to say, okay, forget about it. But he said, yes, you must do this talk, you must do it. So I had to learn about Father Patrick Peyton, and we finished last year. He was a giant of our times. He had millions and millions of people praying the Rosary. And what I said, if you remember last year, is St. Maximilian Kolbe died in the camps in Auschwitz in 1941, and he had the light of the Immaculate upon him. He died, and then that light was really passed to 1 or 2 others, of which one was Father Peyton, who at that point had a miraculous recovery from tuberculosis and began his mission in the mass media to spread the word about Our Lady in the Rosary. So Joseph, this time round, we got a phone call and said, it was very nice to talk last year. What about Frank Duff? So I went and asked my superior again and said, we've got Frank Duff this time. I know nothing about Frank Duff. And he said, yes, do the talk. So I had to learn. I have a confession to make. This is a talk which will be talking about who is Frank Duff, the first talk this afternoon. And I make the confession I make is that I have attended 1 Legion meeting in my life, and I'm being part of the Legion. But I'm in good company because one time in London, the great Father Hugh Thwaites did a beautiful talk on the pioneers, and at the end of the talk he went round the next pub and had a few pints. Okay? So you have to, so Frank Duff, the first talk, we'll examine about his life, and I want to go into some level of detail because this is what shapes the man, and we'll find out the fact that he's a giant of the church, a giant of Our Lady, and a prophet of our times. Now, this afternoon, or later on, we will talk about one of his publications. It's called Can We Be Saints? This is the first part is we watch this video, and this gives you some outline of Frank and how he lived his life. So we ask ourselves this question now. This was just a glimpse of Frank Duff's life. We go into more detail now. Who is Frank Duff? How his life was shaped. When we talk about the faith, sometimes we like to look at holy numbers. So If anybody is familiar with the teachings of the Divine Mercy in the Diary of St. Faustina, 777 is the time when our Lord takes St. Faustina to heaven. This is the number of perfection, 7. And we see the number 7, which is prominent in the life of Frank Duff. First off, he was born 7th of June 1889. He sets up the Legion 7th of September on the Vigil 1921 of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And he dies on the 7th of November 1980, which was the first Friday. We will talk about his devotion to the Sacred Heart. Also, just to keep in mind, since his death was in 1980, this is the year we celebrate 40 years since his death. 40 again is a holy number. And next year, this is a mistake on the slide, next year, 2021, will be the 100th year anniversary from the start of the Legion. We ask ourselves this question. On a natural level, people call Frank Duff the Irishman of the 20th century, or from a more supernatural point of view, we would like to examine this title of Frank Duff as the magnifier of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Going back to his childhood, his grandfather was called Michael Francis Freehill. If anybody knows about Irish history, in 1829 was what we call the emancipation of the Catholics in Ireland, which was assisted by somebody called Daniel O'Connell. 1847 saw the Great Potato Famine. In this famine, 1 million Irish people died and 1 million Irish people emigrated to different countries. After the Catholic Emancipation Act, Frank's grandfather, Michael Francis Freehill, was allowed to start teaching in a Catholic school in a place called Trim in County Meath. His brother emigrated to America and died, and he left £100,000 to give to his family, which was a great deal of money in them times. His grandfather invested in land, stocks, railway, but most importantly, because he was an intellectual, he built up an unbelievable library at that point in time. Frank's parents, if you can see, are called John Duff and Susan Duff. This is the picture on the right-hand side. They were married in the year 1888, and 1 year later, in June, the first child was born, called Francis Michael Duff. Susan and John had 7 children: Frank, Isabel, Letitia, Eva, John, Sarah, Geraldine, and Elias. One of them died in infancy, Letitia. John Duff was a dedicated husband, and the mother was a very pious mother. The father was very dedicated to his work. He worked in the civil service, but he was also very interested in sports, in swimming and in cycling, which he passed on to Frank. The mother was also an accomplished pianist and singer, and many a night she would have all the children gathered around the piano in the family house, singing good wholesome songs. Frank described his mother later as an ordinary good Catholic woman. The mother taught the family how to pray, trained them in the virtues, and took them to Holy Mass. So the life of the Duffs, the family, was quite wholesome, and they were well looked after. Frank's father was intellectual. He also decided to expand the library. By the time he was 10 years old, Frank also took an interest in the library. At 10, he had read the classic novels of Walter Scott and Charles Dickens. He'd even read Cardinal Wiseman's lectures on science and revealed religion. He was well read even at this age on St. John Henry Newman. When he was young, his father and Frank were both struck down with the same illness, which was typhoid. Frank was so ill that they thought he was dead. Both were weakened for life, especially his father. There's a very interesting story. In the year 1899, we remember, Frank was 10 years old, and it was his time to receive his first Holy Communion. He went to confession the night before and made a general confession, but during the night he realized that he had omitted a sin, or he hadn't told the full truth. So before the communion, he asked the priest again for confession. He humbled himself, and he later described in an interview that he realized the extraordinary value of this Holy Communion. One of his sisters, Eva, was 13 years of old. Frank described her as the most intelligent in the family, and perhaps she is a saint because she died of tuberculosis at the age of 13, and she died a very, very holy death. The priest was allowed to administer the sacraments in the last 6 months of her life, and he was very much impressed by her holiness. Frank became a brilliant pupil. He was enlightened in certain subjects, but he had a great dislike for mathematics, believing he had no aptitude for this subject. He was also fond of cricket and tennis, as well as cycling and swimming. One day in 1901, an unfortunate incident happened. Somebody was playing cricket, and if anybody has ever played cricket before, the ball is very, very hard. The ball hit him in the back of his ear, and this affected him for the rest of his life. In 1907, because his father was very sick, his father had to retire from the civil service. Frank wanted this time, remember Frank is about 18 years of age at this time, Frank wanted to continue his education, but he had to join the civil service in order to be the upkeeper for the family. He joined the civil service, and he joined, would you believe, the Department of Finance, knowing that he had this great dislike for mathematics. What did he do? Frank disliked mathematics and numbers, but he was concerned about his new job. How would he cope? Because he realized he had now the responsibility to look after the needs of his family. What did he decide to do? He decided the best thing was to get back to his books. He set about educating himself in higher mathematics and science. Now, this is the point we talked previously. This magnificent library that had been built up by the grandfather and the father now stood him in good stead. And now he entered day by day, applying himself diligently, solving mathematical problems, investigating scientific data, all with mental effort, and all this excited his mind and dispelled whatever dislike he previously harbored towards these subjects. This was no longer just dedication, but a sheer enthusiasm, a quality he carried forward in all things. Unbelievably, because we have all of these holy men, for example, if anybody knows that St. Maximilian Kolbe actually designed in his youth a rocket system. A very genius, and these holy exponents of the faith seem to be touched with his genius. In 1921, in 1910, when he was 21, Frank invented a new system of calculus in mathematics. Hands up who knows what calculus is. Can you give a definition of calculus?
Rates of change.
Rates of change, very good. Top of the class. Top of the class. He invented this system which drew the attention of his bosses in Dublin, and then he was sent to London to explain the new system, which was then adopted. This shows his dedication to overcome obstacles, and he operated all with a marvelous spirit of fraternity and joviality. He continued with his outdoor sports. One time, he realized that his father was living in a place called Trim, which was about 40 miles from Dublin. His father missed the train, so his father had to walk home. Frank, the son, decided, I can do better than that. So he decided to walk back to Trim and then back to Dublin, 83 kilometres. A great change in the life now. In the year 1913, we jump forward. Frank decides to join the SVP in Dublin. Before, he said he was too busy. He joined the SVP conference of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and was deeply impressed what he saw. This was a great change in the life of Frank. Why? Because he began to experience the poverty at the time we saw in the video, which was appalling. Great numbers were unemployed. Families lived in one-room tenements in slums. Hunger, squalor and drunkenness were rampant. There was great religious neglect. Now, the purpose of the SVP is twofold: to help the families in neglect physically, but also, and most importantly, spiritually. And this is where Frank felt that there was too much emphasis on the physical side. He realized in Matthew 25, we read this beautiful verse, and this is what is carried in Frank's heart all of his life. It reads, "As long as you did it to one of these of my brethren, you did it to me." Jesus Christ was present in the poor. Each dirty hand, each grimy face, each weary foot was a member of Christ's living mystical body, crying out for help. This is Frank in 1913. He realized also that he needed to have a stronger prayer life. In 1914, he engages in what's called the first silent retreat. He meets a very holy priest called Father Scanlon, who was a Jesuit, and he gives many lectures on the art of meditation and the great truths of religion, which made a great impression on Frank. Remember also at this time, he is also reading many books, especially on the saints. He can also read in French. He is fluent in French, which means he can read the great works of the French mystics. Early in 1914, he encounters a man called Mr. Lennon, who asks a volunteer to go outside of a centre in Dublin called a proselytizing centre. Now, if anybody knows what this word means, this is where this is the principle to try to convert people to your faith. Now, because the poverty was so bad in Dublin, the Protestants would set up a breakfast house and try to encourage the Catholics to come and have something to eat. But in order to have something to eat, they had to participate in a Protestant religious service. Frank started to pray outside with this man called Mr. Lennon. He meets a man who inspires him called Joseph Gabbard, who used to be in the British Army, but now he had also set up a centre, a Catholic centre down the road from the Protestant centre, to try to encourage the Catholics to have something to eat. He was a man he captivated Frank Duff. Never before had he met somebody, this former soldier, who was now a warrior for Christ. This powerful man, like St. Paul, had put on the breastplate of faith and charity, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. He was saturated in the love of the Mother of God. 1914 saw the outbreak of the war. Frank, and with this great man, Joseph Gabbard, would actually be allowed to go into the barracks in Dublin and talk to 2,000 soldiers at a time, encouraging them to not to lose their faith, to lead a sacramental life, organising confessions, giving out rosaries, brown scapulars, miraculous medals. Frank noticed one day that Gabbard was wearing something on his lapel. Now, this was the badge of the Pioneer. The Pioneer, which is the Pioneer Total Abstinence Association, was formed back in 1898. The primary aim was to honour the Sacred Heart of Jesus, as well as undertaking an abstinence from alcoholic drink And a member must wear, as a sign of being a pioneer, this little badge. Now, Frank had this absolute horror of wearing a little badge. He decided he wanted to be a pioneer, but he didn't want to wear the badge. He had to conquer all his force and his might to crush the human respect within himself to wear this badge. He became devoted, a great devotion now he had to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, reading the accounts of our Lord's revelations to St. Margaret Mary in 1675. His prayer life now started to intensify. We saw on the video the amazing facts of Frank Duff's life. He started to pray 4 hours each day. He started to pray the Rosary daily. He started to do the Divine Office. He would go to Holy Mass most times twice a day. 15 minutes. We jump forward to 1916. If anybody knows the Irish history, the Easter Rebellion was a rebellion led by somebody called Michael Collins, and this was an attempt to move the British out of the capital in Dublin. The rebellion failed, and this was a great shock to the people in Dublin, especially Frank, who was very patriotic. And it said his family was so patriotic that if they traced their family line, they would go back to a descendant called Lord Hugh Maguire, who was hanged for his part in a rebellion in 1641. The people who were the political wing of the Irish rebellion were called Sinn Féin, and they asked Frank Duff to join them. He said that he didn't want to get involved in the violence. He was a man of peace and he had too many things to organise in his life. Frank refused to join. He was saddened by the revolt, and he actually heard the gunfire on that Easter Monday morning. The British forces quickly pushed down the rebellion, and a week later 15 of the leaders of the rebellion were executed. The War of Independence lasted from 1917 to 1921. Michael Collins, the Chief Intelligence Officer of the military wing of the Sinn Féin, now asked if Frank Duff could be his personal secretary, even though Frank Duff was not involved in the Sinn Féin. Frank Duff became his secretary for the next few years, and how happy was Michael Collins that Duff was his secretary, because he was so efficient and amiable and so disciplined. On the morning of 22nd of August 1922, Frank came into Collins' office as usual. Collins said, "I am going to Cork today, give me a hand to organise my things." Frank did so. He waved him goodbye, and this was the last time that he saw Collins alive. The great Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Army was shot dead later that day on his way to Cork. Jumping forward to 1913, Frank experienced, after confession one day, a loss of faith. He was saying his penance, and he realised in a flash of a moment that he had lost his faith. He doesn't know how long this moment took, but he realised that everything he has comes as a gift from our Lord. He intensified his prayer schedule. He saw the need to have spiritual direction. In 1914, he started every morning in the 40 days of Lent to go to Holy Mass, and he continued that for the rest of his life. He started his daily routine would be he would go to Mass in the morning before work. He would work civil service, have a holy hour at lunchtime, work in the afternoon, have a holy hour on the night, have his tea at home, and then have another hour before resting in bed. He was so interested in the lives of the saints. He realized, though, that before to act and have an apostolate, we have to ourselves become holy. He realized now that something was missing in his faith. In 1918, he starts to attend this proselytizing center to pray outside by himself. The first morning he goes outside, somebody attacks him with a knife. A soldier comes towards him. Frank Duff takes evasive action, knocks him down on the chin. The man gets up. Frank Duff gets the knife off the man, and before Frank Duff notices, a lady across the street has already seen what was happening, and she came and she finished the man off on the floor. Okay? The point we make here is that Frank Duff was very, very capable of looking after himself. He was given a certain inner strength. 1918, his father died on December the 23rd, 1918. And the last thing his father, before he died, Frank Duff was very worried about the salvation of his father. His father said a few days before he died, "Frank, can you tell me a holy priest I can make a good confession to?" 1918 was the bombshell in Frank Duff's life. He was working in all of these apostolates. There was a meeting one day in the SVP, and he overheard a conversation between a man with the other members of the SVP, and they were discussing a book called True Devotion to Mary, written by Saint Louis-Marie de Montfort. He listened to the conversation, and then a few days later he was walking down next to the river and he saw the book itself in a shop. He bought it for 4 pence and he decided to read it. The first reading of the book, he thought, this is not true. This is totally extravagant on the part of Our Lady. Somebody else asked him afterwards, "Have you read the book?" He said yes, but he said basically it is wildly extravagant and it's not false. This man asked him to read it again and again and again. He read it 6 times, and then he says in his own words, "I was finally engaged on a final force reading when a sort of phenomenon occurred. Without any process of thought leading up to it, something which I can only describe as a divine favor was granted to me. As a sort of light, the sudden realization came to me that the book was true. A complete conviction that what I'd been regarding as exaggerated and unreal was fully justified." This was the grace he received as a light from Our Lady. He goes now to a retreat in a place called Mont Melleray Abbey in Tipperary. He's given another book called The Knowledge of Mary, which is written by Father Januaris de Concilio, and this is a preparation for the true devotion to Mary. He has a great thirst now, and he tries to read everything that he can read possibly on the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary. He also has knowledge of somebody called Saint Matt Talbot. If anybody knows that Matt Talbot lived in this period, I believe he's blessed, about to be blessed now, and because of the intervention of Frank Duff, then a biography was written about Matt Talbot through the direct intervention of Frank. In 1917, the SVP were working out of a house on St. Francis Street in Dublin called Myra House. Mainly the work was done also as pioneers. In 1921, there was a meeting held in this abode, and Frank had this desire to hold a meeting to explain the beauty of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the true devotion. He organized the meeting. It was accepted. The people decided to go to the meeting 17 days later. This meeting was held on August the 31st, 1921. It was agreed at that time that they would hold another meeting. They first off went to their apostolates was to visit a Dublin Union hospital. This was only run by men. The women at the meeting asked themselves, why can we not get involved in this work? So the meeting was set to discuss this on Wednesday, the 8th of September, 1921, the Vigil of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. This, lo and behold, is the start of the Legion of Mary. 15 people were present, a priest and Frank Duff and 13 ladies. When he went into the room, he saw a statue of the Immaculate Conception on an altar, which was not his idea, with flowers surrounding it, as we have in the meetings of the Legion now. This was the idea of somebody called Alice McHugh. A thunderbolt struck Frank. He realized now that they were in the hands of the Blessed Virgin Mary. We saw in the video also that the greatest poverty-stricken place in Dublin at that time was a place called Monto. This is where the girls of the ill repute in that time, in a square mile, there was 1,600 ladies of ill repute. Frank realized that the Legion at this point would have to get involved and help these souls. He arranged, how much time? He arranged 3 retreats. His idea was to get the girls out of the brothels, to get them into a neutral place of retreat, and then try through prayer not to allow them to go back into the life of vice. He wrote a book called Miracles on Tap about this experience. I haven't got time to show this video. Frank's idea was to get these ladies out because he saw the real poverty and the real spiritual need. So he organizes three retreats. 3 retreats. The first one in the middle of 1922. He speaks personally to 15 girls in the brothel. They agree to make a retreat the next day. He gathers the people together. Every moment is a miracle. And he gets a Franciscan priest there to preach the retreat. And the next day, after the retreat, all the girls, except 2 who are Protestants, gather together and have Holy Communion and confession. He repeats this 2 times in the next year. 3 retreats held to get the girls out of their lifestyle. The first one, he sets up a hostel called the Santa Maria, where he now houses these girls who have been in this lifestyle. 1927, he also decides that the people on the street of Dublin, the men, the down and outs, the drunkards, need a helping hand. He sets up another hostel called Morning Star. 1 o'clock in the morning, he's working in this hostel. He hears a knock at the door. He opens the door. There's a boy, very scruffy looking, very dishevelled, 12 years old. He asks Frank Duff, has he got some room for the night? Frank Duff says, come in, and looks after him. The next day, the servant girl says, the 12-year-old boy has left, and what a beautiful, beautiful boy. The thought strikes Frank Duff many years later, perhaps this was the baby Jesus, this was the child Jesus lost in the temple, who one of the 3 days perhaps spent the night in the hostel with Frank Duff. The spread of the Legion, in 1930 also, he sets up what's called Regina Celli, and this is a house for all of the mothers and the children who are female. There's an interesting discussion, which we could have perhaps later, is about Frank Duff was responsible for also helping many women in crisis pregnancy. In his time in Regina Celli, there was 4,000 children, new children came into the world, and he knew each one personally. And there's this debate in the Legion nowadays, if anybody is aware of it, is this desire for the Legion to get involved in the fight for life, to pray outside the abortion centres or to help the ladies in crisis pregnancy. But many people in the Legion say this is political, but in certain countries they seem to do it, in other countries not. But from our point of view, to help a mother, to encourage her to give birth and to help her in a need, is a moral issue, is not a political issue. So perhaps we can encourage some of the Legion members to get involved in this activity. We saw in the video the Legion was very, very slow to start off with, but it had a massive explosion after the Eucharistic Congress in Dublin in 1932. We saw many, many missions that nowadays we have the numbers of 11 million souls, either active members in the Legion or auxiliary members. Jump forward to Vatican II. We say that Frank Duff was an apostle of our times. Why? Because in the early 1960s, Frank Duff had already tried and tested the idea of the lay people to get involved in the evangelical work of the church, to help and assist the priests. Not as what's happened since the 1960s, where there's this forever push to get involved from the laity actually in what the clerics do. But Frank Duff had this perfect idea because he knew the importance of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Okay, so I'll finish off the talk, and we'll finish off the rest of this talk this afternoon, but the point we would like to make is really to understand all of these events that have shaped Frank Duff's life, and this will tell us this afternoon what we need to do to be saints, because Frank Duff was the one who encouraged us to read the lives of the saints, to imitate the saints. And this is what we're doing now, to learn about Frank Duff, who one day we hope will be a saint.